Hey everybody, it's been a little while since I made a video. Thought I would. Um, just things rolling around in my head. Sometimes it helps me to actually make a video just to have a record of something, even for myself, or obviously if somebody asks me a question, I can just send them a video. Um, I was thinking today a little bit about, the hormonal response to training, and this applies. It can apply in many aspects as far as like strength and whatnot, but I'm thinking, I always speak more on a bodybuilding or an aesthetic aspect. Obviously, a muscle, in order to hypertrophy, it gets stronger by hypertrophy, and you can't get away from that. But that's a byproduct of the uh, muscle growth, rather more so than if your strength training and some muscle mass would be a byproduct of that. They're a little bit different. In a lot of aspects, they're the same, but they are a little bit different because with strength training, you're learning certain techniques, using some kinetic energy in certain ways. Whereas with mind toward hypertrophy, you are wanting to strictly put all emphasis just in that muscle. Use certain technique to make a lift easier, or use a little kinetic energy or something like that, like in a competition, say, powerlifting um, or like a strongman or CrossFit or something like that. Those sorts of things um, apply in some aspects, but not anything like bodybuilding and figure things like that. That this applies 100% toward that. So the training aspect, your mind always wants to be geared toward maximum hypertrophy of those muscles to give them that nice, big, round, exaggerated look. And there's certain things that create this hypertrophy. Like we said, we've blown the lid off the micro tearing. That's just done and gone. It's done and gone. But the hormonal response is the best way to put it. All the different growth factors and hormones, the body would be maximally stimulated in order to release these. Without stimulating the growth hormone and creating all these growth factors, and the central nervous system response telling these growth factors and hormones where to go, and then the activation of the receptors in which they go in. Without that, we're kind of pissing in the wind. You know, there are some guys in the past that like just use machines and created decent, like good physiques, but these guys were also taking a lot of synthetic drugs. And then at that point, releasing the growth hormone and things like that aren't as important because they're injecting large amounts of this stuff into their body. And from there, it's literally just activating the receptors. So, like the tension on the muscle, activating the receptors in the muscle, and then, the androgens connecting to it, and the growth factors, things like that, creating myoblasts, But even at that, it's proven that somebody in that aspect doing more stabilization geared movements, compound movements, and using some variable resistance in their training is still going to benefit them. Um, and that's why for years and years and years, a lot of guys would always say that no matter who it was, I don't care if it was Mr. Olympia or if it was, some amateurs, whatnot, they would always say they got the better results from like free weights. If we're talking like static resistance, because you're doing so much more stabilizing, and the growth hormone output is greater. Um, Now, sometimes some of the machines they helped you from manipulating the body and making like a curl easier. You're stuck in this machine, and then you're basically stuck squeezing the muscle or something like that. So there's like a, a toss up in some of that stuff. I guess that's why I was saying machines aren't useless in a sense, but you learn to use them properly. So like if you're going to use machines, for example, they'd be good for a warm up or a pre exhaust, something like that, before you go do just your main movement. Um, like you always see guys squat and then go do leg extensions or something. Honestly, you're better off doing the other thing. You're better off doing just some lighter leg extensions, getting some blood in those quads, warming those knees up, pre-exhausting a little bit, and then go do a compound movement. And that muscle is going to have to actually work a lot harder in that compound movement, and then it's going to be forced to come up and adapt. The muscle, when stabilizing, sometimes like 100 pounds, for example, use that as just a generic weight. If you don't have to balance anything, 100 pounds might feel very easy to a muscle. And then if you got maxed, hold on, I got this needy little cat. And then under stabilization, the muscle might feel like that is a lot more. And it's all the perception of that muscle. It just knows how hard it's working. So in some aspects, we can use less resistance when we're doing high stabilization and get the same, actually better result because you got a higher hormonal output. Yeah, you're spoiled rotten. Then see what the, like, now we talk about the variable resistance. The variable resistance, like with the bands and whatnot, where I like that opposed to just raw weight. The weight load when you're lifting a weight does not change. It's the same through the entire movement. We can manipulate it to feel a little bit tighter in some aspects like at a certain point of the lift, or maybe in the negative or something like that. But in general, it's the same amount, and it can be cheated. For hypertrophy, you're cheating yourself. If you create any kinetic energy, it takes attention off that muscle, and then a large part of the muscular hypertrophy is activating the receptors in the muscle. But then you have to have the hormonal output to connect to those receptors. So tension creates testosterone production, okay? And tension activates testosterone or androgen receptors. They kind of dovetail together there. And then stabilizing and balance releases growth hormone, and stabilizing or balance under tension releases very large amounts of growth hormone, like more than a person can inject. And now that I'm experiencing this, I see the true rewards of it. And the people that work under me are also seeing it too. They're staying leaner, getting leaner all the frickin' time. And they're not doing anything different. If anything, they're eating more. They're doing no cardio, things like that. And, they're growing, and, muscles are getting denser, they're getting leaner. And they're just using literally rubber bands and balance. So your hormonal response to the training is literally, without the hormonal response, without the activation of those receptors, and without the release of the growth factors and androgens, things like that, you literally have nothing. A lot of people, I call a lot of things like a placebo effect. You might get into a machine, you might feel a decent contraction, but that's not a lot of stimulus, and you're not going to have the hormonal response to really do a lot with that. So like, and one of the biggest aspects I like with the variable resistance, is that muscle in the stretched position is not compromised, and and when it's when the tendon is in its strongest point and the muscle's in its strongest point, you can actually use a load. You can make it so it grows into a load that you normally wouldn't be able to really use with static resistance, because you'd be limited to like 1 rep. And we know that there's not enough volume in that to really create hypertrophy, because part of it is burning all the energy out of the muscle too. Okay. Every drop of oxygen and fuel out of that muscle, then that makes it have to take on more of that also. Okay. So we want to make it take on more energy sources, oxygen, and proteins. And that's all done through the stimulation of our training. And what the muscle perceives as hard isn't necessarily just more weight all the time. It just knows it's working really, really hard. And in order to make that easier on itself, it has to become larger and stronger. Okay? Or take on more fuel, things like that. And when the central nervous system is taxed, it is telling all these places, like all these receptors, it's telling the body all these receptors to activate, and it's telling the hormones where exactly to go, so that it's the body's really, it's actually really amazing. The more we learn we need to learn. But with all this in regard, at least we have a lot better outlook on what's going on. So instead of just repeating certain lifting, what would you say, styles, different set and rep schemes and things like that. A lot of it, people are doing, they work, but they really don't even have a full idea why they work. A lot of it. And sometimes we think that we were doing it and it was creating results because of something, but we were wrong. It was the hormonal response. It's just like when you're stuck on plateaus on bench pressing and you throw a couple bands on it, you're feeling more load at the end of the movement, so the muscle has to work harder through clear to the end, and it activates more androgen receptors. Then the muscle gets larger and stronger, and you take the bands off, then obviously it's going to be able to lift a little more of the iron. So that's where, if you're looking at it from a bodybuilding aspect, we can actually take the iron away, because as long as that muscle feels that resistance at some point and burns every drop of energy out of it, that's all you need to do. And with variable resistance, we are able to create that in every rep. You start out, and as the muscle gets to its stronger and stronger point, it's growing through more and more and more and more and more resistance till it reaches a point where it's basically, imagine the muscle pushing on a rubber ceiling, it just can't get any more. That's going to activate more receptors. And the next rep you're doing the same thing, and the next rep you're doing the same thing. And with weight training, you can't, I've explained, you kind of, if you were to do a drop set, you could kind of manipulate it in an aspect thinking like that, but it's still not anywhere near the same, because you're using the exact same load through a whole lift. You'd only be able to, do a couple, and then take the tension off the muscle, let the blood come back, research, and then do it again. And they end up doing a lot of damage, and the volume gets really high. The recovery time is greater. With more recovery time, we're losing out on time to grow, because the more times we can stimulate that muscle maximally and put that hormonal output out, and then recover and and train again, the faster we're going to grow. So if we can maximally stimulate a muscle every day, put out more hormones, and recover it, and train that muscle every single day, it is going to grow faster. Okay. So that's whether a guy's natural or not, those aspects are still going to be a factor. And obviously, the more natural somebody is, the more important that's going to be. Well, like I said, it still doesn't change the fact that it helps in all aspects. Okay, and I would like to see a lot of guys, for example, powerlifting and strongman. Obviously you can't get away from the weights because a lot of the events built around these things, so that you have to train these. But so let's say they're like strongmen, for example, they have their functional training. They might do strength training like the front squats and some overhead pressing and deadlifts and like carrying things, stuff like that. And maybe one day a week work on like form for certain events, like the log press or something like that. But in between, they could use a balance and variable resistance to stimulate their muscles and not like tax the joint, because our muscles can heal a lot faster than the joints can. So a lot of times our joints are what end up holding us back. It's not our muscles. Okay, so like after a lot of these heavy movements and things like that, they've obviously found ways to use bands and variable resistance as a way through training to get a little better results. And when in your basic training, if you're not at an event, you can use a little less just raw weight, so you're not taxing the joint in the stretched position, but you're still pushing through that heavier load. But then on their days in between functional training, could actually use a lot of variable resistance and balance and get really good results with keeping those muscles strong and healthy, and give the joints a break. Because let's say they're doing, a lot of guys might just do some different stuff in between, and they're just using weights. Eventually the joints start to really hurt, and you got to take time off to let them heal, and then the muscle is just kind of sitting there and not doing anything. And if we're not stimulating the hormones and activating the receptors in the muscle, it will start to go downhill. That's where I've mentioned before. I think a lot of like high androgen amounts, they were used for like catabolic purpose, like things as far as wasting diseases. They they lower cortisol and make the general uh, protein synthesis a bit higher in the body, so the muscle doesn't break down at the same rate. So these guys can sit between workouts and not atrophy, if that makes sense. But they're not going to advance unless you're stimulating those muscles, creating growth factors, and activating receptors. You got to have something for the hormones to stick to, you know. And all the different hormones, growth factors, and stuff, they all work synergetically. You got, growth hormone, insulin, testosterone, things like that. There's a synergenic amount effect in all of that. And again, they dovetail off of each other. And a lot of, if these guys have large synthetic amounts of androgens in the body, but they're not stimulating the growth hormones and regenerating things and receptors and producing the IGF-1 and things of that nature, you're going to be missing out on a lot of growth. So I hope that kind of clears up some things, you know. So I went over like the tension, balance, stability, kinetic energy. We get rid of that. What I like about, again, with kinetic energy, with hypertrophy, we don't want any of that. The variable resistance, because it's growing through the entire rep, it really takes the kinetic energy away and causes a harder contraction. And then from there, we also have stretching, okay? And that's one thing that a lot of guys don't do, period. And with using just like the bands and whatnot is something that I've started implementing a little more even for myself, because I'm not stretching the muscles under the loads as much. Because I'm getting more into the contraction. So like I'll, after I get done with like shoulders and chest, I'll go into a dip and just hang and let my muscles stretch. This has been shown in a lot of studies. It's been shown hypertrophy and hyperplasia, and it's best done when the muscle's hot. It's got blood in it. It's on, got a pump. This is one aspect I think where DC training had something right, was the active stretching. But with pounding ridiculously heavy weights and then active stretching, we can really start to hurt sometimes after a while. But the stretching itself isn't going to hurt you because you are not pushing out of that stretch. You are getting maximal stretch, making that muscle tolerate it and everything, and then just getting out of it. And that's where Emmerich Delzig's training was really smart in the aspect of feeling maximal load. If you weren't using variable resistance in certain movements, like say a chest press or a bench press or a squat or something like that, you get actually the most stimulus into the negative, because when you're fighting gravity with weight, these certain movements where you're pushing, you come down, the arms go out, that the pec is going to feel the most load in that bottom portion. So he would add more weight than you could actually push onto a bar and bring it down to that, and that muscle still feels that load. So if you're still activating all that stuff, but then they would take weight off and you could push it back up safely into the contraction and then do that again. So with in the time period with just raw weight, that was genius. But you're limited to a lot of times machines, and you have to have a couple training partners usually. So but it was a way to get it done. He got it done. So, but the video's getting a little lengthy. I'll cut it off here. Everybody have a super great, wonderful day.